morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 127 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I've got my regular co-host, Ian Kummer, from a suburb in Moscow. And one of our special guests is John Jeter. He is a former Washington Post columnist or journalist, and he's currently living in Washington, D.C. He just came out with a book called, is it Class War in America?
Class War in America, How the Elites Divide the Nation, by asking, are you a worker or are you white?
Okay, so we're going to get into that. Our other co-host is Patrick Corbett, and he is joining us live from, is it Vancouver, Canada, I believe?
Vancouver, that's right. Yeah.
Lovely city.
So John, let's get right into the book. I did not read the book, but I did read a lot of reviews of the book, and people are very happy with it. My understanding is that you tackle the issue of, should we have a perspective based on class, or should we have a perspective based on race? And this kind of is a bit of an ideological tussle nowadays, especially in academia, and can you just give us your how your book synthesizes these two perspectives?
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to begin with, because it is the principal question that I'm trying to answer. Is our discontent based on a class struggle, or is it based on a racial crisis, right? Racial polarization. My response, to be reductive, is that it's both, and you can't separate one from the other. You can't parse the two. The reason being because in the United States, and to a lesser extent, I think throughout the Americas, racism serves a very utilitarian purpose for the elites, for the oligarchs and the 1%, which is to separate the working class, right? To divide the working class, to pit it against one another. We've seen that in other places, right? It's not just unique to the United States, but I would argue that no country, probably in the history of the world, has used racism to the extent that the United States has, to essentially quarantine the most radical, traditionally, historically, what has been the most radical sector of the working class, which is the Black working class. And that's not genetic, right? That's not because we're from Africa. It's because the most oppressed people typically are the drivers of transformative change, no matter where you are, no matter the country, right? The most oppressed people are typically the drivers of change. You could argue that it would be Native Americans in the United States, but the problem that 90% of them were killed by the genocide of the colonizers within a century. So that's the thesis of my book. And what I try to do is I try to document, not in an encyclopedic way, but I try to tell stories that show how when we come together, the Black and white working class come together, historically dating back to the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, we've moved forward. We've modernized the country. The working class has carved out a bigger slice of the pie for itself, and the country has moved forward. The economy has worked very much better. We haven't had peace. We've never had any peace. We've never been able to eradicate racism. We couldn't do that in 50 or 60 years, what has existed for 400, 500 years. But we have quieted that racial discord in times when the working class is carving out a bigger and bigger slice of the economic pie, of the gross domestic product. And so it's not meant, I should say this too, I think, it's not intended to be hard on whites or to say that all Black people are the solution, right? What we know and what I hope I showed in the book is that there are times where whites have really stepped up to become tremendous allies for the working class, for Blacks. I read a lot about Ethel Rosenberg in the book, and the Rosenbergs and what they did. One of the women who accused the 9 young men in Scottsboro, Alabama, of rape in 1931, one of them recanted her testimony, recanted her accusation, and she became a real ally for Black people. And you see examples all throughout history. Viola Liuzzo, who of course was killed driving civil rights poll workers back and forth. You see this, and that collaboration is really what drives the country forward. At the same time, I should end on this note. While I definitely think I think history has shown that the Black working class is the vanguard of the revolution. What we've seen, particularly over the last 40 years, is the way that I describe it as racial capitalism, right, as opposed to racial democracy. Racial democracy being when Blacks and whites work together, which we saw a lot during World War II, the last years of the Great Depression, up until the early 70s. Very tenuous coalition, but still one that was functional, and it really moved the country forward. But the way that racial capitalism survives is that it continuously peels off a layer of working class people to become white or white adjacent, right? It was in the 1800s, it was Germans and Italians and Irish. It's been women. It's been Jews after the Holocaust and World War II. Not all Jews, but a lot of Jews. We saw the rise of people like Milton Friedman, the economist Milton Friedman, who really staked his claim on providing a way out for white parents to send their kids to school without Black kids being there. And so what we've seen since really, I would say, the end of the Reagan era, the late 80s, we've seen the rise of this Black middle class and professional class that has joined with the white elites to help oppress all working class people. Barack Obama is, of course, the prime example. Kamala Harris is a great example, but we see it in the Congressional Black Caucus, right? So I say all that to say that I, as a Black working class person, have no more in common with Barack Obama or Kamala Harris. I have more in common with the gentlemen gathered here than I do with that Black working class, which has switched sides.
So that's definitely coherent and consistent. So I mean, it kind of begs the question. It's like, how to progress forward, how to deal with what I think is an oligarchy, right? I think
Yes.
Social what is it called? Liberal democracy is just it's a facade. It's an illusion behind which exists and operates oligarchy. And they don't mind if some of the oligarchs are people of color. Most of them, of course, aren't. But it's their oligarchic interests, which is what is driving policy, as opposed to what's in the interest of the masses. And to overcome that, that's what the class struggle is. And that's what the class struggle in America is. But in America, it's like, they have just done such a great job of indoctrinating the entirety of the working class in different ways. You have the white liberals who, of course, are indoctrinated in a certain way to embrace liberal democracy. And, they deny that we have an oligarchy and they hate socialism. And then you have, there's a white conservatives who, maintain a bit of racism still. And even if they're not going to say outright that, white people are superior, they will talk about culture, and it's Black culture that's the problem. That's it. It's just Black culture.
Right.
So,
or Putin.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
The question of the Black Power movement or Black nationalism or whatever you want to call it, essentially like a more of a hardliner position like Huey Newton was advocating for, basically voluntary segregation, where you have a Black community, you build up Black businesses, you keep the money in the community. Would you say there's a place for that? Is it part of the solution, or is it work against the solution? What do you think?
That's not an easy answer, but I'll give you as succinct as I can. I think the radical Black Power movement, certainly over the last century, has been the most powerful and transformative working class movement that we've seen certainly in the United States. I think you could argue in the world, and at the same time, you would be completely right if you said it failed, right? That it didn't achieve its objective. But what it started was a conversation, a framing of our reality that led us to a solution. Um, One of the big revelations in my book was my interview with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn, the new left activists from the 60s and 70s, Weather Underground, SDS. And I don't mean to insult Bill Dohrn, but Bernardine Ayers is uh, just a juggernaut, an intellectual juggernaut. And she told me two things that I think were really important to answering your question. That when she began with the SDS, I think she was a young law student, first year law student, maybe at the University of Chicago, I think. And when they began Students for a Democratic Society in 1966, I think she was, I think, the first president of the national chapter, and she would go around the country and, oh, good Lord, and she would tell people, she would tell student organizers that they should first get the facts. What their university, are they investing in the Vietnam War? What they're investing in, what their university leadership is doing. But the second thing she said was, you should find out what's happening on the historically Black college campus across town, or the Black Student Union, and you should follow Fannie Lou Hamer, right, with the Freedom Democrats, the Freedom Party in Mississippi was doing, right. That was that was your link to what's really going on a foundational level, right? And the other thing she told me was that the Weather Underground was formed. It began forming in late 1969, I think September, and it kind of formed very quickly after, or really came together, congealed really quickly after Fred Hampton was assassinated in December of 1969. And there was a famous meeting, or fairly famous meeting, in Flint, Michigan. And she, Bernardine Dohrn, took the podium, to the dais, and she said, what we need to understand is that, and she was speaking both of the Black Panthers, but also the Vietnam War. And she was saying, what we need to understand here, because everybody in the crowd, I think, was white. She said the only thing that a Black power movement, a revolutionary Black power movement needs is a revolutionary white power movement to support it, right? And I think that is basically a theme of my book, is that Blacks, again, as the most oppressed people, tend to kind of have an understanding of the problem that is fundamental. And whites, no matter how well-meaning, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, are just a little bit detached. That, of course, is racial capitalism. That is the point. You will find that in apartheid South Africa, too. You would find whites, even the most well-meaning, who are detached a little bit from the most grievous problems caused by racial capitalism. And so I said that to say that Huey Newton, I think, was one of the real visionaries. I didn't write a lot about him in my book, but the ethos that was produced by the radical Black power movement, particularly Malcolm X, Huey Newton, Fred Hampton, Eldridge Cleaver, and Kathleen Cleaver, probably even more than Eldridge Cleaver, and the rest were all children of Malcolm X, who taught the politics of self-reliance. And what you see in the politics of self-reliance is, and there's a long history of this, so I hate that I'm not really doing it justice, but what you see emerge from Malcolm X and his politics, right, particularly at the end when he was a Pan-Africanist, but he what he believed, and this goes back actually to the freed people, right, after slavery, they believed this as well, was that the working class could work together, right, collaborate, but that racism was so embedded, right, that we needed separate groups. We needed white people to work on white people, and Black people to work on Black people. And so you would see, for instance, one organization I write a lot about is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which formed in Detroit after the 67 riots in Detroit. And they operated on the factory floor, on the Chrysler and Ford and GM plants, other factory floors. They organized Blacks, but they encouraged whites to follow them, to form sister organizations that moved, and they would work, they would collaborate, but they had their own groups. I think, and I think, Ian, you might find this interesting. I think that actually is probably the best way forward, because racism is very real. It has become, and I write about this in the book, it has become, and particularly in the United States, but you also see across the Americas, in Brazil and Venezuela, racism is almost like a religion for a lot of people. Present company, I'm sure, excluded, but for a lot of people, it's like a religion. So that spell is hard to break. And what you will see is that, and I hope I touch upon this in the book in a way that people understand, but a big model for, I think, the United States, not necessarily that it become communist, but Lenin and the Vladimir Lenin and the revolution of 1917 in Russia and the Soviet Union is a model in a lot of ways. What do I mean by that? The Russian, the czars, under the czars, Russia was known as a prison house of nations. There were, I think, almost 200 different nationalities. And what the czars would do is they would pit one against the other. Well, basically, they robbed the people, right? They were basically borrowing money for expensive projects that were only utilized by the rich, and they were neglecting the people's social needs, and they would pit the people against one another, particularly Jews, so that the pogroms against the Jews in Russia before the Russian Revolution were really horrific, very violent, very prolific. And so one of the things that Vladimir Lenin did, one of the first things he did, was to not necessarily act like they were that tribalism was eradicated, but he wanted to exalt every group, every ethnic group. They were exalted, right? So that just to give you one quick example. And so in the early years, I think this faded fairly quickly after Lenin's death. But in the early years of the revolution, it was criminal to be racist or to be have some sort of ethnic bigotry. I'll end with this quick story. It's probably more than you a bargain for, Ian. There was a black activist in, I think it was 1922. The Soviet Union had a school called the University of the Toilers or something like that. It was basically teaching revolution, and there were several blacks, I think dozens of blacks, who went to this school in Russia, and they learned Russian, and they learned about communism and Marx. And one of them was a guy from, I think it was from Omaha, Nebraska, although by way of Chicago, I think. He went to Moscow. His name was Harry Haywood. Haywood, I think, yeah. And he talked about he told a story about being on a streetcar one day, 1922, I think it was. And he's on a car with some of his black comrades, 3 or 4 of them, and the car's full of whites. And a white Russian gets on the streetcar, and he's drunk. He's obviously inebriated, and he hurls a racial slur at the blacks who are on the car. And Harry Haywood, this is 1920s. He's lived in Chicago. He's heard it all before. They're nonplussed. They're not bothered by it. But everyone else on the train is livid, right? They're like, "What did you say?" And they're ganging up on him, and it almost looks like it's going to be a mob attack. They demand that the streetcar driver stop at the police station. They take him to the police station, and they demand that they file charges. And the Russian who was by now starting to sober up and realize that he's in serious trouble. He says, "I'm very sorry. I didn't really mean any disrespect. I just been drinking. I didn't mean any disrespect." And they asked the 3 black Americans, what do you want to do? They said, "No, it's fine. It's cool, right?" But the point is that it was criminal to be a bigot because they saw that as central to the communist project of a workers' proletariat dictatorship. They saw that racism, eradicating racism and tribalism, was central to their project. So I say all that to say that this idea of segregating people, I think, is going to be necessary. There's just a trust factor. I mean, we have to be honest, right? There's just not. I don't think in the black community here in D.C., in Oakland, I don't think that you can have a black movement where black people are going to be trustworthy. Honestly, now that I think about it, even Black and Latinos, I think you might be able to form some working coalitions there that are more integrated, right, in the communities, whatever. But I think, and this is what I'll say at the end. I think what Fred Hampton meant when he said Black power for Black people, white power for white people, brown power for brown people, X power for everyone left out, was this idea of a kind of republic, right, of different tribes where everyone's exalted, everyone has a certain sovereignty. Of course, you have a central government, but everyone has their own community they live in. You know, what you do with it, the work you do, the ownership of that community, what you teach your children. There are some sort of backstops about what you can teach and what you can't teach, and for murders, of course, going to be wrong no matter what community you live in. But that each community has a certain sort of sovereignty, and it all works towards this national project, which I think is what very similar to what Lenin had in mind when he came into power, when the Bolsheviks came into power in 1917.
What do you think? And since you brought up Russia and Lenin first, I assume you heard about those Black leftists in St. Petersburg in Florida.
Yes, I know about Chairman O'Malley. Yes.
Moving forward with Trump as president, because I don't think Trump is a communist. I think that's fairly safe. What do you think under Trump, for the next 4 to 8 years of, the way things are, what do you think should be the approach to internationalism? Because you see what I'm saying. Like if there's, communists do like to talk to Moscow, they like to talk to Cuba, they like to talk to China. What do you think should be the strategy? And not get arrested.
Let me start this way. We're going to be in for a fight. People will be arrested. People will likely die. I think that's the lesson we learned from revolutions past, particularly the most effective ones. And that would have happened no matter if it was Trump or Kamala Harris who won the election. It's very clear. It might have happened more with Kamala Harris even. But so let me start with this. I do think that we're onto something. I think if you read the book, a turning point for the United States was the Scottsboro Boys case. 9 Black teenagers on a train. They're hobos. They're looking for work. And the Communist Party, going back again to Lenin, their idea, was what was called the Comintern, the Communist International. They had a few years earlier passed a resolution saying that they were looking to support the African liberation struggle, no matter where it was. And they really targeted the United States. This is in the late 20s, but they didn't get a lot of traction. They didn't get a lot of membership. People were interested, but still they couldn't quite gin up this enthusiasm. The Scottsboro Boys case was 9 Black teenagers falsely accused of raping, sexually assaulting and raping 2 white women who happened to be sex workers. They worked at a textile mill in 1931, during the nadir of the Great Depression. They were laid off from their jobs. So they would actually ride the trains as well, looking for work, sex work. And there was an encounter on the train between the 9 young Black men and a similar sized group of 9 or however many, about the same size group of young white men who were also riding the train looking for work. There was a fight. No one was really hurt, but the white men were all thrown off the train. They reported the incident to the police, and they stopped the train near Scottsboro, Alabama, and arrested the boys. It really is an amazing story because it's so pivotal and it's so sort of anticipated what was to come. The NAACP didn't really want to touch it, so because it was uncomfortable. They weren't sure about the boys' innocence or their guilt, and they feared it upset their white donors and their Black bourgeoisie base. The communists were very excited about the story. They immediately pounced on it. They sent 2, I think they were both Jewish communists, to Scottsboro, to Alabama, and they were the ones who really moved the case forward, the story forward, by reporting that the women were sex workers. They were the first to report that the women were sex workers, and they framed it as a frame-up. They said this is a frame-up, right? They're trying to framed these boys, these young men are political prisoners. And anyway, it took years, but the communists really, by collaborating with the Black working class, started. It really was an invasion, right? It wasn't militaristic, but it was an invasion, and it did change the United States. That really is kind of the basis of the Cold War, in that the communists had a message that resonated with working class people, because it started a very real interracial movement that lasted for the next 40 years. It wasn't perfect, obviously, right? There was still a lot of racism in the South and elsewhere, but it started a real coalition. 4 years after the Scottsboro Boys, we had the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was deliberately integrated union, and that really moved the country forward. Why do I bring that story up? Because I think I see in what's happening in Gaza, right, and the response to it by Americans, a wide coalition of Americans, many of them Jewish, many of them white, many of them college students. Think about college students, particularly at Ivy League schools, who are basically boycotting their future employer. But they're saying it doesn't matter, right? What's happening in Gaza is too important. There's a young white man who I quoted in the book, who was interviewed at the University of Chicago. I think it was back in May, after the police shut down the encampment there, the anti-genocide encampment there. And he was so eloquent. The reporter kept asking him, "Don't you fear retribution by the school? They're going to kick you out. They're going to discipline you." And he was very firm and very eloquent, saying, "I don't care." Right? He said it's an insult to even think about what the president's going to do to me, when there's some woman in Gaza right now who has to decide, do I let this kid starve or do I let that kid starve? Right? Which kid do I let starve? Right? And anyway, I say all that to say that I think that this response to the genocide in Gaza is redolent of the Scottsboro Boys, a white people basically renouncing their racism and the privileges afforded to it, right? And saying, no, we're with these oppressed people, this out group, this racialized group of people. We're with them, and we're willing to fight with them. I see in that what I saw in the Scottsboro Boys. I think it has the potential to be a very transformative movement. I do think things are going to change fairly quickly in the next few years during the Trump administration. I think we're probably going to see an economic crisis, very much like the Great Depression. I think we could very well see that. I think it's probably more likely than not. I'll say that at this point. And so the signs are shaping up that we will see another movement similar to what we saw in the 1930s and 40s. How far it will go, I can't say, but I do think we'll see a real kind of dialectical clash, I think. What do we need to do? I can't say. I think the working class needs to tell people like us what they want, and we say, well, this is, I think, how we get there, or this is one of the ways we get there, or this is the way that we get there. We kind of mix it up. We kind of, it's a conversation between people like us, I think, and our working class brothers who say, and that's what happened. I should say that too. That's what happened during the Great Depression. That's why the Great Depression, the New Deal, the organizing, the labor organizing, and the civil rights organizing that occurred, that accrued from the New Deal was so powerful, because you had academics and you had media people, not all of them, and not even most of them, but you had academics, intellectuals. I don't know if you know, people know Lonnie Guinier, but her father, Lonnie Guinier, she died a year or two ago. She was civil rights nominated by the Clintons to head one of the civil rights division in the Justice Department, and she was her nomination failed because they called her a quota queen. She was very smart, brilliant woman. She wasn't advocating for quotas, but she did want to address racial disparities. Anyway, her father, Ewart Guinier, was an economist, I think, and he would do things like, say, General Motors. I can't remember the exact examples, but things like if General Motors wanted to go on strike after the war, right? And they would say, well, we want a 25% pay raise. And he would actually go and figure out, well, if you get a 25% pay raise, the profit margins will be this high, right? You can even do 30%, and they'll still be making a lot of money. he would provide the scholarship that actually fueled the movement, the revolution, right? That's what we need a return to, is that kind of dialectical exchange. But anyway, to finally wrap up your point, so I think that what we see, because what happened in Scottsboro was this a movement, the very specific Scottsboro Boys, Free the Scottsboro Boys, is an international movement, South Africa and Indonesia, where they were also tuned into what was happening to the Scottsboro Boys, in part because of working class people like one of the mothers, Ada Wright. She went all around the world raising money and preaching the cause of the Scottsboro Boys. And she would say, or people would say of her, she doesn't know a communist from a cowbell, but she was a very effective spokeswoman because she was, it was her fight, right? And she connected with communists and with white people all across the world. So it really became a cause to leverage. I can see that happening with Gaza, with the anti-genocide movement in Gaza, where it intersects. We're already seeing it, where the anti-genocide movement in Gaza is intersecting with things like the cop city, the construction of cop cities all across America, particularly in Atlanta, where they're trying to construct cop cities to prevent what happened after George Floyd in Minneapolis. They're kind of, it's kind of a bunker mentality, and so we're seeing that the anti-Gaza protesters are that movement is intersecting with other causes. That's what happened in Scottsboro. So that intersection is important. Here's what I think needs to happen in general terms. How it happened, the people really need to tell us, I think. There needs to be some real political education about what we're up against, who the real enemy is, right? Jesus from Oaxaca is not our problem, right? He's not responsible for this crisis. Vladimir Putin has nothing to do with the fact that we don't have a healthcare industry that actually heals people. We have a healthcare industry in America that actually sickens people because that's how we make more money, right? So we need some sort of political education for everyone, right? That really tells people what's the state, what has been successful in the past, and what has not been successful. How did we get to this point? We need to have a discussion about, something you never hear about. I write about a lot in the book. Something you never hear about in the mainstream discourse is bonds. Municipal bonds, city paper, federal government municipal bonds that are sold to rich people. Austerity, which is to cut public spending, is really a con for the rich, because what it means is to cut public spending, you have to borrow more money from the rich at higher and higher interest rates, which is really the beginning of the class war back after the Civil War. And to that point, we're spending almost as much on interest payments to rich people now than we are spending on the U.S. military. More than $1 trillion a year is going in interest, right? That the taxpayer is paying to very wealthy people around the world, although mostly Wall Street, basically because it's a con job. It's a bait and switch, basically. So we need to have these political education courses. I think that's the predicate for any real change. This intersection of causes. Gaza, I think, is the moral. What's happening in Gaza is the moral center of the universe. I say that as a Black man who sees. I think when we look back on this period, we're gonna see that this is the greatest outbreak, the worst outbreak of racial violence last 10 years since the Red Summer of 1919. I think we're gonna see that here in the United States. I think the numbers will show that. That's my belief anyway. I don't have the research to say that definitively, but I believe that's going to be the case. But having said that, what's going on in Gaza right now? Nothing moves until that stops. That has to stop. So I think, and Fred Hampton said this. Revolution takes you from one phase to another phase to another phase. So I think when we stop this genocide in Gaza, then we can move on to cop cities, to student debt. And let me just say this. I'm sorry, I'm being very long-winded here, but your questions are so great. This movement that I think we're seeing that is culminating, unfortunately, in this crime against humanity. It's culminating in this crime against humanity in Gaza. It really began. This speaks to my age, I guess. I was in New York City when the subprime bubble real estate market crashed in 2008. And I remember Occupy, the emergence of Occupy. And I was very interested. I would go to those movements in 2011, 2012. And I was very impressed by them. They were mostly young, many of them Ivy League students or Ivy League graduates, young kids, young people, and they saw that something was wrong, and they were right. And the thing that really, and this was really when I first started thinking about this book, Class War in America, they made an effort, at least in New York. I don't know about everywhere else, but in New York, they made a real effort to reach out to Blacks and Latinos in New York City. The problem was that we were so distant. They didn't quite know how to find them. They didn't know quite how to intersect with them, right? They didn't know what organization, they just, we've been estranged for so long. We're a nation of strangers, and they just didn't know how. But they made an earnest effort, I do believe. Most of them made an earnest effort to contact with their Black and Latino working class in New York City. And then Black Lives Matter was another extension of that, I thought. And that was a middle class movement that really left the Black working class behind, but still it was another, if I may quote George H.W. Bush, it was what do they call it? The tentacle of light, right? That reached out, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it built upon the Occupy movement. And now I think these anti-Gaza protests, we have connected a little bit, right? Because of these movements which built on one another. And I just think that the I don't know how this is going to turn out, right? It might not turn out like the New Deal did, and it might not be as good. It could be much, much better, right? It could be. We just don't know. The New Deal really came out of nowhere. And there's no reason to believe in 1931 that we were going to have the country that we had for the 40 years after the Depression started. But political education, I think, labor organizing, which we're also seeing a resurgence of labor organizing in the United States. That's going to be a big deal. That's going to be very helpful. And I just think, coming together to fight for each other, right? Live for each other, as Dostoevsky say. And it was Chekhov, I think. Yeah, Uncle Vanya. Yeah. So specifically, I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think that's the next step. And we insulate people as much as we can, whatever strategies we can identify, because it's going to be a fight. That never in the history of the world have the oligarchs, have the rich just said, "Oh well, forget it. Okay, you win." That's never happened. They're going to fight back. We need to be prepared for that, and we need to strategize for that, and understand. We are many, and they are few.
John, there's something that I wanted very much to ask you today. In the sort of revolutionary attitudes of the late 60s, early 70s, you had Black leaders and a couple of white leaders like Fred Hampton and Malcolm X. And my view was that what the ruling class did was set out to deliberately decapitate the leadership of the revolution, and they were afraid of it. There's records of Henry Kissinger and
Nixon.
Yeah, they were cowering in the White House. So
that's right.
I think that was really clearly on the cusp of a revolution, and I just wonder, what would your attitude be if we got there again? However, we did, and I agree with you. I think we will. But how do you protect, and how important are the individual Black leaders, or the individual leaders, not just Black, but in this case, primarily Black? And a sort of sidebar question to that is, are there going to be enough people who will willingly accept Black leadership, because African American people are the ones on the front lines, and so they're most likely to be, as you called them, the vanguard.
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I write. I don't know if you've gotten to this part of the book yet, but I write a lot about that period of time and the counter-revolution. And you're right, they were terrified of this revolution that was, and not, they weren't just terrified of its potential, right? Because if we had kept on the pace that we were on in the early 70s, we were capturing more of GDP, a greater percentage of GDP than ever in history. You had strikes by the thousands, labor strikes, and not just labor strikes, but you had the women's movement and you had LGBTQ movements, all of these progressive movements, right, that were built upon the labor organizing and the momentum from the 30s and 40s that were surging ahead in the early 70s. And it's very clear the oligarchs, Nelson Rockefeller, was it Nelson, or it might have been his brother? Nelson was the governor, right? It was his brother. I can't remember his name now. But he wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce, I think it was, saying, we got to stop this thing. And that produced, I think, ultimately the Powell report, Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice after he wrote this memo to the Chamber of Commerce, where he said, we got to nip it in the bud on the college campuses, nip the discussion in the bud, and we've got to form these think tanks. If you think back, that's after that was when we saw this flourishing of think tanks, many of them conservative, like what's the big one now?
Heritage.
Yeah, Heritage, yeah, but also I was thinking about the one that ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, which is responsible for so many of these very conservative policies. But you saw this flourishing after that memo, the Powell memo, of efforts to purge academics from the college campuses and I think he only made one specific reference to race in the Powell memo, but he said we have to separate particularly these college kids from this radical Black power movement, right? It's very clear what he meant, to decapitate that movement. And that has become, until this day, where now you really don't hear, I mean, really some of the greatest intellectuals in the Black community right now are in prison, right? Let's just be honest. Abu Jamal, and many others who people probably haven't heard of, but that's where some of the greatest intellectual energy comes from, is our prisons. Will white America be accepting of that in a leadership role, in a vanguard role? I don't know, Patrick. I'll be honest. I don't know. I think a lot of people don't have any problem with it. They understand the history. They understand what's at stake. And I think a lot of white people, I say this all the time, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Russians, the French, the Scandinavians, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Brits, everyone, these are glorious people, but the white settler is something else, right? And so, these Europeans who are here in the United States, who have been propagandized to death, who don't, and this, one of the ideas I talk about a lot, I write about a lot in the book, is Orientalism. The idea of the media framing stories and writing stories and creating even entertainment that qualifies racial oppression and even, I think, gender oppression. I think a book I would like to write at some point, I think, I'm looking into it, I might not be the right person to write it, but is a book on how porn is a representation, is an Orientalist medium. It's an Orientalist representation of women who you can view as colonized people, right? And so this Orientalism, this depiction of reality, this mischaracterization of reality, is really a big barrier, right, to us getting ahead and to people sort of understanding that, Blacks, Latinos, some of the most radical people I'm meeting these days are Latinos from Mexico, from Guatemala, from El Salvador. I think that's why one of the reasons we're seeing this movement in labor, this resurgence in labor, is we have these newer immigrants. Many of them have been radicalized by their own struggles, Oaxaca and present land struggles in Mexico and Guatemala, the struggles there. And we're seeing an expression of a solidarity from these groups. And that's why I think we're seeing what's happening in Amazon and Starbucks, right? Which Starbucks doesn't look like the General Motors workforce, the Chrysler workforce where my father worked for 30 years, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So to try to answer your question, I don't know if we're going to reach that if we're going to click in that full-throated way, because that, of course, is what killed the New Left, right? You didn't have people like Bernie Dorn, I think, were the exception, but for the most part, the New Left, the new young white New Left, couldn't accept the idea of blacks being in leadership positions, right? That they were as capable as anyone to lead this movement, or at least to be, co-leaders in this movement. They still hew to this idea of whites telling blacks what to do. And that's going to be a real challenge going forward. It's going to be a real challenge. And again, maybe speaks to why there needs to be, black power for black people, white power for white people, but working on universal, blacks and whites need to work together on single payer health care. We need to work together on Gaza. Most pressingly, we need to work together on reversing this horrific genocide in Gaza. These universal ideas we can work together on, and then maybe, we think, I have an idea, probably it's not appropriate to talk about now, but maybe talk about reparations in a class-based way. Reparations for Black Americans that can help all Americans, right? All working class Americans, right? Maybe we, just as one idea to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, maybe we restore the Freedmen's Bank. We put it in the Black community. It's a nonprofit bank owned by the Black community, the Black working class, by the Black community, South Side of Chicago, North Philadelphia, Southeast Washington, D.C. And that bank offers low interest loans for student borrowers, for mortgages, right? This is a way I think everyone gets ahead. I think this is the way we need to think about, right? In sort of addressing our this fundamental character flaw we have in American society, which is just this tribalism that just won't die. At least not yet. Maybe it will in a century or so. I don't know, but at least it just hasn't. We haven't been able to kill it. So how do we address it in a way where we all move forward?
So that's a lot, John. You've given us a lot to discuss and to think about. And I don't know where I want to go, really. We talked about.
I've confused you.
What'd you say, Ian?
Well, you did, John. You mentioned Gaza. I want to say with this last election, I am pleased with the results. And the reason why I say I'm pleased with the results is because Biden bombed the hell out of Gaza. He bombed Russia. I mean, there was this, if he had done all that and gotten away with it, it would have been I think it's an honest statement that would have been the end of the American political system. It would have just been the end. At least with Trump, we can say, look, it was a clear, even if you don't like Trump, you say it's a protest vote. You cannot commit a genocide and get elected. So that's a good thing.
Yes.
And I will give the MAGA people the credits that they did reinvent the Republican Party as a right-wing movement. Do you think with this loss, like with the Republican loss in 2020, do you think Democrats are going to be able to reinvent themselves and maybe adopt left-wing, some, God forbid, left-wing ideas? Or do you think they're going to double down on punish? And by double down, I mean, do you think they're going to punish the pro-Palestine people? Do you think that? Because I could see that going either way. They could say, well, we're going to become more leftist, or they could say, you know what, we're going to blame those people for us losing and crack down on them and help Trump crack down on them. What do you think?
Oh man, that's a great question. Well, let me say first, I am like you are very pleased with the results, and I loathe Donald Trump, but to have elected Kamala Harris would have sent a message that emboldened the Democrats to continue on this course and even ratchet it up. So I'm very happy that the Democrats lost. It is, I've written about this. I wrote about it in the book. The Democrats have, since Bill Clinton, and I'm sorry, I'm going to give a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I'll try to keep it succinct. When Bill Clinton ran for office, I think it was the second time in 1992 for president, the Democrats had been out of the White House for 12 years, and they were trying to figure out how do we get back to the White House. And they had two models two very disparate models. They had Ronald Reagan on the right and his race baiting appeals, dog whistle appeals to white blue collar workers, and they had Jesse Jackson on the left, who expanded the Democratic Party, was trying to expand the Democratic Party, did expand the Democratic Party in his two presidential campaigns to include, to attract, to excite, to enthuse blacks, working class whites, poor whites in West Virginia. He was really expanding this, and the most progressive mainstream presidential platform probably in history, certainly in the 20th century. And Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who were with the Democratic Leadership Council, formed the Democratic Leadership Council, really. They clearly chose Ronald Reagan's model, and they decided they were going to compete for racist white votes by being more racist than the Republicans. And there's really no other way you can look at that if you're sort of a serious person, right? People talk about the omnibus crime bill and its unintended racial disparities. They weren't unintended. They were the point. They meant to show, and you can characterize everything that's happened, particularly in the presidential campaign. You can characterize the Democrats' every move. The exception would be Biden in 2020 because that was in the moment, the George Floyd protests and people were out in the street. So he had to make promises to black people that he immediately walked back as soon as he was elected. Not even in office. When he was elected, he walked them back. But you can look at everything. Barack Obama scolding black fathers in a black church, when there's information, I'm sure Barack Obama knew this, that black fathers who are estranged from their families spend more time with their children than any other demographic, right? So why do they present this? Or Kamala Harris campaigning with Liz Cheney. How many black people were going to go to the polls because she's campaigning with Liz Cheney? And they knew what they were doing. They know what they're doing, but they didn't know what else to do. They don't have the imagination. There's a great story in the New York Times. You don't say that every day, but there was a great story in the New York Times a few weeks ago about campaigners in Philadelphia. I think they were younger people, and they were worried in the run-up to the general election that the Democrats weren't paying enough attention to particularly black and Latino voters, working class and poor people. And they kept saying to their bosses, hey, we need to pay more attention. And the bosses kept saying, don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. Just, stand down. And they went on their own. They went rogue and they started knocking on doors. Obviously, it wasn't enough, but because they still lost Philadelphia. They lost, blacks and Latinos just didn't turn out to vote for the Democrats. There was no reason to. But this has been a strategy by the Democrats and you can see it in every campaign. Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Barack Obama's mishandling of the subprime mortgage crisis, which disproportionately targeted blacks. It was known in other countries as racialized lending, is what the subprime mortgage market was, right? He deliberately mishandled that in a way that is going to, I think, ultimately crash the U.S. economy and the empire. I think it's going to be, I believe that's going to be of sufficient size to crash the U.S. empire. This is a deliberate strategy to out-racist the Republicans. This idea that, number one, that it's going to be static, right? That you're always going to have this sort of white majority racist base that you can appeal to and turn out. When the numbers clearly show that's not true, right? That's just not, you don't have that the way you might have had in 1988 or even 1992. You don't have those clear, stark numbers. The country is darkening, and that means they should recalibrate their strategy. Will they? I would have to say, if I were a betting man, I would say they won't. I don't. If you look at the people who are in charge of the party, if you look at their actions since the election, right? Nancy Pelosi, and AOC is no progressive. Let's not be mistaken. But her basically handpicking the older white, I can't remember his name, the older white congressman head of that committee rather than AOC. I just think there are no signs that the Democrats get it, that they understand. And then you see, I think, a deliberate attempt by Biden to basically preempt any kind of moves by Trump to correct course. And there are very few opportunities for Trump, very few reasons to believe that Trump will correct course. But One of them is in Ukraine, where he has said he would end that war. And you see Biden doubling down on the war in Ukraine, which is a lost war. It's a completely useless war. The United States has no real political interest in that war, other than to increase profits for defense contractors. And if they were going to win this war, maybe create a new market for American capitalists. But that's not going to happen. So there's, it's just throwing good money after bad. And let me just say this is, I think, really important. So I don't think the Democrats are going to get it. And we're going to need a real electoral strategy. And I don't know what that's going to be. I don't know if it's another party, if it's the Green Party, if it's like what we did, what they did, our parents and grandparents did in Gary, Indiana in 1970. Was that 1973 where they talked about having a black party, which won't be, a black party would not be, it wouldn't win office, but it could be the game changer, right? Because whites are typically kind of divided close to 50-50. So blacks tend to be the kingmaker in a lot of statewide and national races. But I don't know if that's the answer. I don't know. I just don't know. The people I think are going to have to tell us what the answer is. But the predicate, again, I think our political education course is to understand why we have chosen this road, this path, right? Ukraine is important to the United States because Reagan began to hollow out the manufacturing sector in the United States, which was the golden goose. That's how we made money. That's how the American people made money. My father was an auto worker, and it wasn't great work, but it paid a decent wage because there were unions. They shipped that offshore. It used to be 40% of all jobs in the United States were, almost 40% were unionized manufacturing jobs. Now it's closer to 9%, I believe. Right? That's the golden goose. So the oligarchs did this. The bosses did this for two reasons. One, they wanted to lower wages, right? And two, they wanted to disempower the radical Black Power movement, which was influencing whites, particularly in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. They were very influential to whites, even on the factory floor. I know that seems kind of counterintuitive, but they were influential in modernizing the country, and they wanted to disempower them, right? But what they did was they killed the golden goose. How do you make money if you make nothing of value? Well, the only way you can do it is speculation. And you don't have to be an economist to understand that, there comes a point when you loan out more money than people can repay, right? That's where we are now. It's a speculative economy. The ways that if you have extra money laying around, there are very few opportunities to invest it to make more money. One of them is a healthcare system that kills people as opposed to heals people, right? Another is war profiteering, right? And the third, and we're seeing this destroy a country like Argentina, is loaning out money to poor countries and developing countries and making them pay a very high premium for that money, right? This is how the United States makes its money today. The three main ways they make its money: selling these bonds, investing, loaning money to these countries at very high premiums, which breaks the country. It's not a sustainable model. And so Ukraine is part of that strategy, right? Where we make money by war profiteering. I think initially when they thought that they had a chance to actually bring Ukraine into NATO, that they would basically break Ukraine the way they broke in Argentina with all these loans for military equipment, for, all manner of things, privatization, which is what they thought to wreck half the world over the last 30 years. And so, so I don't see the Democrats having the capacity, the critical resources to fix the party. I see that if it's going to be fixed, the people have to do that. I don't know how. I don't know if we sort of infiltrate the Democrats with working class people, or if we start a third party. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we the people are going to have to force the issue.
It was surreal what you mentioned about Liz Cheney. It was surreal with this election cycle, seeing them trotting out, look, Liz Cheney agrees with us, Mitt Romney agrees with us, George Bush, all these generals and CIA and NSA guys, look at how they all agree with this. Like they were proud of it.
Oh, they were. I think they were there because they're so isolated. They're so insulated. They have no idea what's happening. And I thought the same thing. It was surreal, and it shows just how they have no counter argument, right? They just don't. They've they're in a corner, right? It's like almost like rats. They just fight. They're just fighting. There's no strategy. There's no surrender. There's no, okay, we need to recalibrate this. Just no sort of consciousness. It's funny, but this sort of self adoration doesn't produce any. The self worship of the Democratic Party doesn't produce any kind of self awareness, right? It really, they just don't seem to understand the political moment, the historic moment. But and this is the last thing I'll say about that. I do think though that we're approaching a really dramatic financial crisis. The numbers just suggested that something big is on the horizon, it's imminent, and that might really kind of it might force people to think differently, even in the Democratic Party, possibly, right? It might, maybe there is a faction of the Democrats who will be more Bernie Sanders like, or sort of like look to his model, his initial model, before he kind of caved in to the party. Maybe that will happen. And that will create a synergy with people, working class people. I don't know, but that could happen. I think where that kind of financial crisis really just forces the Democrats' hand.
We talk in terms of fixing the Democratic Party, but in a certain sense, I mean, from the perspectives of the oligarchy, I think things are working just fine. I mean, both parties are representative of the oligarchs. Neither party cares about the working class. And I'm not sure it's ever been different. I mean, really. But, so I kind of foresee a financial crisis too. You're kind of talking about the subprime time bomb that has been, is in our economy, and it's they're pushing it off, and at some point it's going to explode. That's very possible. But also, I think a war with Iran could definitely cause a energy shortage around the planet, and then the U.S. would be in relatively decent position to weather that better than other countries because we're a net energy exporter. But still, it would be a global crisis is going to affect Americans too, and then that could cause us to wake up a little bit. But you talk about class or race is kind of where we began. And, Marxism is about understanding the interconnectedness of everything. So like you said, you can't detach class from race. You can't take race out of class. It's the same thing. Your book kind of does document historically how the Black movements have been backstabbed by white people. And so it's interesting, and I think it's kind of provocative, right? That you were advocating in a certain way, kind of a voluntary segregation as progress, which I think, because some people might not really buy into, especially now when you see it. There's like a top-down effort to normalize, interracial relationships. You can't watch a television commercial without seeing an interracial marriage. So, and I think these are good things. I think these are good developments. I'm not opposed to the top-down, putting out there of, multiculturalism and everybody needs to get along. How do you understand that? Like, how do you process this? On one hand, you're saying progress is maybe a little bit more communities based on race, whereas you actually see the oligarchs pushing this interconnectedness, of course, for their own ends.
Yeah, that's a great question, Billy. That really is.
I'll give you an hour. You have 1 hour.
Okay, so it's I should take the whole hour. It's very complicated. I do agree. When I talk about a community based, I'm thinking more of a sort of an anarchist based kind of model, right? Which is not anarchy, but a localized governments, right? Grassroots communities. One way we can use segregation. We already have segregation. Our communities are very segregated now. Use those communities to promote kind of a local sovereignty to a point, right? Not everything is locally decided, but to a point. What kind of jobs? What do you teach your children? Those kinds of things. The problem, I think, and this is a very difficult pill to swallow, and one that I did not enter when I first started writing this book, or even thinking about it. I don't think I understood this, but there is a lot of water under the bridge, and so I just don't think. So let me give you an example, a very quick example, something recent I think that kind of explains it. In Missouri a few months ago, and Missouri is really kind of a hotbed of apartheid politics in America today. But in Missouri a few months ago in September, the state executed a black man, Marcellus Williams, who was convicted of killing a white woman in 1998 in her home. The killer left a ton of forensic evidence, blood and hair, footprints, none of it linked to Marcellus Williams. None of it. And it was a ton of forensic evidence. Marcellus Williams was convicted on the testimony of two informants, two witnesses. One was a career criminal who I think has since died. I think they might have both died since. Career criminal who just recently found out he was infected with HIV, was facing going back to jail for some petty crime, and saw that this money was out there to arrest the killer of this woman. A year had passed, and they hadn't found the killer. And he saw that there was money available that was made available for the arrest and capture and conviction of the killer of this woman, the wife of a doctor in St. Louis. And he said it was this guy, Marcellus Williams, who he had been locked up with, who had done some other petty crime. Marcellus Williams had, I think he might have robbed like a donut store or something really silly. And that was his kind of MO, like just petty crimes. And then there was his girlfriend at the time who was a sex worker and who probably, I won't go through the whole story, but probably if she probably wasn't the killer, but she probably knew the real killer. But she said it was Marcellus Williams, and the police really pressured her to get her out of. She was facing some jail time as well for her sex work. So this is the testimony he was convicted on. There's no forensic evidence. Advocates basically said he should get at the very least he should get a new trial, right? And the state of Missouri, it was just not a concern. They executed him in September. Almost certainly he was an innocent man. The Innocence Project, I think, defended him, and they said he was an innocent man, and he probably almost certainly was. That kind of thing is normative in the United States, right? Like it's almost a cliche of the innocent black person being killed. And I say that to say, and we don't know this, I think, because again, we're just not connected. We've been disconnected over the last 30, 40 years. If you ask most black people, especially poor and working class black people, would they trust whites fully in an integrated movement? They just wouldn't, because of stories like Marcellus Williams, which happens all the time. So, partly it's not even. I understand it's uncomfortable, right, to say it, because we think about this, Rainbow Coalition, people walking hand in hand, Martin Luther King, and I it hurts me, right, because I have great friends who are white, and I love them, and I would die for them, right? And so it's sort of anathema to say, but it can't, in a systemic way, I don't know that it can work, at least not right off the bat. And so it seems like, I think the best way is to build power in our individual communities, come together for these universal prescriptions, of which I think there can be many, like I say, I think a basic income grant for poor Americans, working class Americans, would be a good idea. I think worker co-ops, in all these communities. How do we create a network of worker co-ops that create things that are sustainable, right? That don't hurt the environment, and that produce goods, repatriate goods that really benefit us. Baby formula. Remember during the COVID epidemic, there was a lack of baby formula. Why can't we make baby formula at one of those shuttered plants in Detroit, right? So these kind of things, I think we can come together, and I think there should be almost mandatory integration, right? But this period of integration has really been very harmful to the radical Black Power movement that fueled our modernization, our social transformation. I think most Black people have some understanding, and let me say this too, as well too. And the other thing is, I think that, and this might be the case, I don't know. It might be that the most transformative actor going forward is the Latino community, particularly from Mexico and Guatemala and Central America, Honduras, El Salvador. Many of them mixed race, many of them indigenous, and mixed with something else, the mestizos, as they call them. If they might be the most transformative actor going forward, right? But those people, I think they're very much in play, where there is this effort by the elites to make them white or white adjacent. We saw this a few years ago. I think it was 2 years ago, when the LA City Council, the Latino members, the president, and I think it was 2 Latino council members and a labor leader, all Latinos got together, and they were talking about redistricting. And do you guys remember this at all? And they were critical. They were critical of everyone. Like they were critical of other Mexicans, and I think Jews and Armenians, every group. But they were really critical of the Blacks. And there's a tape out there. If you listen to the tape, what they're doing is they're auditioning to be white. It's like meritorious manumission for the slaves, where you audition to be sorry, a coffee maker, to be white. And so they're very much in play. But I think that let me give you a quick story about that. And so after this tape was revealed, and the really horrific things, they threatened violence on a 2-year-old Black boy. After this tape was revealed, Black Lives Matter protested one of the city council members named Kevin De Leon, who I think just lost. He was the last one, I think, to be ousted from office. And he's in a Latino neighborhood, and the Black Lives Matter protesters, they picket his home. They're outside, and the Latinos come out, mostly Chicanos, I believe, and they form a counter protest. But they don't know what happened. And so they finally start talking to the Black Lives Matter protesters. They're like, "Why are you protesting, our councilman?" And they tell them what he did and what he said. You know what happened? The Latino protesters, the Chicano protesters, switch sides and start protesting against the councilman that only seconds ago they had been protesting, they had been in support of. I think that is a template for what might very well happen, where we see a Black-Brown coalition really take the lead, right? We see that, I think, the Amazon workers, I think there's a very heavy Latino faction. We see it with the Las Vegas Culinary Union, which is brown and Black, and they are transforming Nevada politics. They really are. And we see it in this resurgent union movement led by a huge influx of brown workers from the South. And so I say that, this idea of segregation, while I know it's a bitter pill to swallow, I do think there are opportunities. And I think those opportunities for us to come together and collaborate, I think that will begin to tear down the walls that we need ultimately to become a real United States of America, right? But I just don't think right now, I think we've been strangers for so long. I think there's so much mistrust. And again, these Latinos, many of the Latinos, I saw this when I was in California, in the Bay Area, and I saw it in New York even. There's a real battle going on for their sort of political souls, but I see a lot of empathy between these Black, new, brown immigrants from the South and Black African Americans. I see a lot of solidarity that's being expressed there. It's too early to call it. I don't know which way it's going to go, but I just see a lot of solidarity, but I think that speaks again to very much like Lenin's motto of exalting, everyone sort of being exalted, right? But being accountable for their own space and collaborating to create this republic, this confederation, if I can use that word, of communities that works together to create this workable, functional democracy without racism, as much as, or at least where racism is weeded from our institutions, racism becomes just a personal animus. That's what I see. It just can't. I don't see a way it can happen overnight. Is my point.
Yeah. Ian, did you have something to say before I said something? I was going to talk about identity politics and just how, those are exploited definitely to keep us divided. But I thought you might have had something to say, and I didn't want to interrupt.
Well, I had something similar. I was just going to ask, do you think race relations, American race relations now are better, worse, or the same as 20 years ago? Before Obama, before the recession, before Trump, before all of that stuff. What do you think?
I think everything in America is degraded. We've never been a perfect country, and maybe arguably not even a good country, but the last 20 years of American politics has degraded every institution. And even more importantly, I think relationships, even in the Black community. I mean, one thing Obama has done, and I have never been a fan of Obama. I don't chalk this up to any kind of special intelligence. I just had the intuition as someone who lived in Chicago, who knew people in Chicago when he first ran for Senate and when he first kind of came on the national stage. I've always seen Obama as a Manchurian candidate, and I believe I've been proven right. But one thing Obama has done, Obama has really, really deepened the class fissures in the Black community, where we've always had class fissures in the Black community, but now, and you saw with Kamala Harris, where Black working class people were just not going to vote for her. There's no trust. So the mistrust, and this happened during the Kerner Commission. In the Kerner Commission, they captured this reservoir of mistrust between the Black working class and the Black elite. But I think it's much, much deeper than any time I've seen in my lifetime, and I'll be 60, Lord willing, next month. I've never seen it this deep, where I would argue that the Black working class, of which I consider myself a member, that our mistrust of the Black elite rivals our mistrust of white people, generally speaking. Right? I just think that it almost, if Obama now says to a Black worker in my neighborhood, for instance, if he says, well, the sky is blue, I think that person will seriously consider whether or not that sky is blue. I think they have earned that level of mistrust. I think, so I think race relations are much worse. A lot of that's because of the media. The media is just, and I say this as I guess I'm still a journalist, but the media in its misrepresentation of reality and its failure to explain what's really going on. I mean, how often does the media write about bonds? How often does the media write about, this idea that the economy is great and the fact that you're hungry? Well, you just don't understand, right? How great the economy is too. I mean, it's nonsense. And so I remember 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I guess, there was a reporter at the New York Times, Judith, I cannot remember her name now.
Judith Miller?
Judith Miller, thank you. And she was really an outcast by basically becoming a stenographer for the Bush administration leading up to the Iraq War, where she basically just wrote down everything they said, and then she would write it up, and then the administration would say, see, it's in the New York Times, right? And she was really an outcast because of that. That has now become the norm of reporting, right? I never see, I shouldn't say never. Very seldom do I see two things. One, storytelling. Why is storytelling important? Storytelling connects the dots, right? If you tell a story, you're first of all, you're humanizing people. This is what happened during, I mentioned the Scottsboro Boys case. One of the things that was very telling about the Scottsboro Boys was the media, not the mainstream media, right? Which depicted the the sexual assault allegations in the typical way, the way you would expect the mainstream media to depict it. But in that alternative media, particularly in the communist organs, the Southern Worker and the Daily Worker, they talked about the history of class and how the bosses wanted to pit blacks against whites, and that this was symptomatic of that, right? You had two white, they were sex workers. They talked about how these two sex workers, two women, white women, how they lived in I think one of them lived in a black community. They were what we would call, derisively, I would use this term, but I think a lot of people would, white trash, right? That they were the poorest of the poor, that they were victims too, basically was the point, but that they weren't, they were not to be trusted in making these sexual assault allegations. That's what the media exposed back then. We don't have that. We do on a very small level, and it's very hard to see them or find them with all the algorithms. But we don't have a media that will interpret the facts on the ground as they are. And so people don't have the critical resources at the moment to really know what's what. I mean, how many people understand that you know, the United States destroyed the most prosperous country on the African continent, not sub-Saharan Africa, the most prosperous country on the African continent, right? Where a Libyan citizen could get 2 PhDs and not even buy a single book, not buy a pencil out of pocket, right? Not pay for it out of pocket, right? Got a check, got free housing. Who understands that it was the Obama administration that destroyed that country, created open-air slave markets where the Muslims in Libya basically targeted the African immigrants who came to Libya to work at Gaddafi's invitation, and that to this day there are tensions. There have always been tensions between Muslims and blacks in Africa, but now they're probably worse than they've ever been. So we don't have a functioning media, we don't have a functioning healthcare system, we don't have a functioning educational system. Right? These schools are terrible. I just learned that the schools in Baltimore, many of them are still contaminated with lead. Kids can't even drink the water out of the fountains. And this is 2024, and kids can't drink water. The media doesn't tell you these things. So race relations are worse. I think relations within of the black community are worse. And I assume that's true for every other community. We just don't have the misunderstanding. We don't have institutions that can, we don't have democracy because we don't have the institutions that contribute anything to our democracy. They contribute just the opposite, which is to this sort of creeping. You might even argue fascism is already here, but certainly it seems to be imminent.
John, you said that you expect something big in the financial realm, and I agree with you. I think we're on the cusp of something that's going to put us all against the wall, and that's not a good thing, except that it would be a common factor for the working class to be confronting that would be bigger than things like racial divides.
And so I'm sorry, what's your question?
Well, I'm making the comment that I'm agreeing that some big cataclysm might come, and I'm suggesting as part of the conversation whether you, and my question would be whether you agree or not.
Oh, I see.
That if this super catastrophe, financial catastrophe, would be so overcome everything else, and we just have to deal with that. That could be a uniting thing.
Yes, no, that's my. I don't know if it's my expectation, but I think that's very possible, right? And it might get worse before it gets better. It might be. We might see the next few months are filled with all sorts of fascist overtures, by the Trump administration. But I do think it seems like, it's sort of Antonio Gramsci, right? People only start to respond and to react and to organize when you're at rock bottom. And it seems like rock bottom is coming up. I mean, despite the fact that the media sort of portrays this, and even some, I don't know how they would describe themselves, but people who we would associate on the left, they say that the economy is doing great, and it's like, well, why would you say that, right? I'm thinking about people like John Mearsheimer, the political scientist. I heard him say a few months ago on a podcast that the American economy is just doing great. Just can't, what economy are you describing where you pay $1 trillion in interest payments to rich people, where the manufacturing economy has been hollowed out? Consumer buying is at a historic low since they began measuring it. Consumer spending is at an all-time low, or consumer activity, at least, is at an all-time low since they began measuring it in 1961, I think. It's very clear that people's debts are outstripping their buying power or their ability to repay, and that we're headed for, it's just, and this is, and I do respect John Mearsheimer. I think he's one of, I think he's useful in our conversation, particularly when it comes to understanding, foreign policy. But how an academic at the University of Chicago to say that the economy is just doing so well is mind blowing, really, right? And so, anyway, I just say I agree with you. I think that we could see a catastrophe. I think it's very plausible. I don't know if I'd say it's possible. It's likely. I think it's very plausible that we could see a catastrophe. Financial catastrophe that is of sufficient size that, as Gramsci says, it represents rock bottom, and people understand. Much like Occupy, I think Occupy had that understanding. They couldn't quite pull it off, but they had that understanding that we need to pull together and collaborate. And, how quickly can you erase, particularly the last 40 years? I don't know. Or how much of it can you erase, quickly? I don't know. But I do think there's going to, catastrophes, unfortunately, can be consciousness raising, right? And I think that we might see a catastrophe that is consciousness raising for enough people. Yeah. And particularly, again, last point, with this darkening of America, with these brown people who are moving from Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, who are radicalized by the struggles in their country. I do see that, it is very possible that we can have a real revolution, working class, and one that is effective.
Inshallah, as they say, God willing.
Yes,
I hope so. I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that race relations, or however you want to describe that, are getting worse over the last 20 years. Like I really just see everywhere with the newer generation more tolerance, more anti-racism. Now, and like I said earlier, it's kind of there's a top-down push for that. Yeah, but of course, the top-down push is a diversity of color only, right? It's not a diversity of ideology. So the Black Myth Leadership class, is all about, doing the bidding of the oligarchs, just in blackface, really. But still, this idea of diversity. So I think the younger generations, each successive generation, is far more tolerant, far less hung up on skin color. But no, hey, if you disagree, yeah, that's cool.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry.
No, I mean that's my point. So I wanted to hear your response to that point.
Yeah, and you're right. It's complicated, right? I do think I taught journalism for a semester at the City University of New York. Is 11 years ago, and my students, I still keep in touch with a few of them, and they think about race and politics and news even in a way that is much different than I think my generation. The people, for instance, people I work with at the Washington Post, white reporters even. So I agree with you. On the other hand, though, I think that I'm not sure that is the rule. I think that while there are a lot of young people who I'm impressed by, there are at least as many who I find very discouraging, who don't have any kind of understanding. And I see this really, in the inability of people to communicate ideas other than what has been programmed in their heads. And I mean that of Americans, white, Black, just most Americans don't have the ability to think the way I think we probably saw 30 years ago. So that's why I would say race relations are worse. But I agree with the caveat. There are a sizable number, significant number, a critical mass of young people. And again, I talk about the Occupy movement, so they're not as young as they were, but they're still there. You're right. There are people who get it, and there's a significant number, and we see that with the labor organ. Yeah, I won't retract it, but I will soften it. Right, I will soften it. I think that there is. I think it's very ambiguous, sort of what's happening in race relations, where we do have a lot of young people who I think get it. And we see that with the labor organizing, and not just labor organizing, but successful labor organizing. Right? If you think about the strike at Amazon on Staten Island, that was mostly it was blacks, it was Latinos, it was European immigrants, right, who had just come over, right, who did that. And then they had was it Amazon? Was it in Bessemer, Alabama? A few months later, I think, and they couldn't get it done because they were, I think they were mostly white. They didn't have the sort of diversity, right? And so that diversity is creating, I think, opportunities, and I think it's expanding our understanding. But at the same time, and I think you're right. I shouldn't have spoken in such absolute terms. At the same time, I think that diversity is making a lot of people double down on their racism, right? To identify this sort of Aboriginal menace, be it people who are my skin color or people who are lighter skinned but who are from Oaxaca and Michoacan, that they are the problem, right? And not that you don't have a healthcare system. So yeah, I shouldn't be so absolute. It is. I think it's both and.
And I'm not saying these people get it. I'm just saying that, with the newer generations, as far as their understanding of race, and a lack of, a zero tolerance for racism. I just see that proliferated so much more in the echo chamber, within society in general. Now, that's not to say that these people are politically or ideologically astute, because that's still a very small margin of people. But as far as, but there has been a normalizing, top-down normalizing too, which I think is good, of, racism is bad. And, we should not judge people based on their race. Now, we can judge them on their culture, which is what they do, right? Which is another form of racism. Right. But, anyway, no, this is a great talk, and I really am glad, John, that you are not at a loss for words, because it makes the discussion so much better. And I could listen. You're a great orator.
I've never been accused of being shy.
Before we go, John, I wanted to mention that I wasn't able to get your book in time for this. And I came across a review of it by Diane Lake in Facebook. Right. And you commented on that. And she offered to loan the book to a friend of hers. So I contacted her on Facebook, and she said, "Sure, I'll lend it to you."
That's funny.
So I got it, but it was over the Christmas period. So I read half of it. And I blame you for a lot of that, because it's very dense and takes a lot of thought to go through. So, but I will finish it this week, and I'm looking forward to it, especially because my sort of period of being an activist was around the time of what we spoke about a little while ago with the murder of so many of the leaders.
I hope it's not so dense that it's hard to read, but I do think you will like the chapters. I can't remember the chapter embedded, and the chapter after that I think is UAW, You Ain't White. I think you'll find those chapters really interesting, because they speak to that period when I think you were active, the New Left, and the I don't think many people understand just the lengths that the political class went to crush these interracial movements, and that interracial character of those movements was really a thrust of their efforts.
Right. But I didn't say it's hard to read. It's really quite engrossing, but it takes, you need to pay attention.
Yes. I'll plead guilty to that. I hope you enjoy the rest of it.
Thank you.
So we hope to have you back, John, and you really deserve a much bigger audience than we are providing. But if you can come back and join us on another occasion, that would be great. I think there's a lot more room for engagement with your understanding, and I think definitely I would love to do that. But I'm just hearing you, and I'm trying to process everything and trying to figure out where we agree, where we don't agree, and I can't think of anywhere we disagree really. I
haven't heard anything big. No, I haven't heard anything big.
There's a problem. The problem is, that they control, the media, both political parties, the economy, and therefore people's perceptions and ideas. And this is just a huge obstacle for any kind of movement to overcome. Yeah. And then they throw, then they're able to manipulate the issues of race, and it makes it just that much harder. But these are all things that we have to overcome. And sometimes it seems insurmountable. It seems hopeless. It does. But there could be some changes, and there could be events that are, catalyzing, that really do help to wake people up. And I think, 4 years of Trump, not because he's Trump, but because of it's Trump. And then there's all these other factors, geopolitically speaking. There could definitely be some serious shakeups that change life as we have known it for generations. Yes. And that'll be an opportunity to make some serious headway in getting a mass movement that can actually make progressive change. But I would argue that we've seen very slow progressive change throughout the decades. That might be one point of small disagreement.
I think it's worth talking about. I would love to see you read the book, which is clearly self-serving, but maybe we can have a discussion then. But one thing I talk about is how it seems to be, since the end of the Civil War, that these cycles of it's sort of racial reconciliation and progress, and then racial repudiation, and those are the periods. The racial reconciliation is where we move forward. Racial repudiation is where we move backward, and they seem to occur almost like biblical epochs in every 40, 45 years. Now we really saw the last period, the New Deal consensus, fall apart around the Carter administration, Reagan administration. So it's been about 45 years now, I guess, almost 50 years. You could say, but so I guess what I'm saying is, if my book is correct, we're overdue for a correction and a period of racial reconciliation. So I'm hoping for that. It is. These are despairing times. I've not seen it this bad in my lifetime, and as you can see, I'm very, very old. But I'm hoping that we come together. And I guess I should say too, I have that much faith in America. I think that it is probable that we will come together. I guess the only question is, how far will we get in this go round?
On that note, Ian, if you got anything else? Okay. Thanks, Ian, for co-hosting with me. Thanks, John, for being our special guest. Patrick, our other special guest. We will reconvene next week, and I'll see everyone then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.